last thing I want to do before we get to our esteemed speaker is just show you an example of a way somebody is promoting his podcast. And it's Evan, who's on the line, Evan Shine, who's a divorce attorney in New York. The name of the podcast is Shine On. And he came up with this idea. I did it, but it's his idea that we record. We usually record all of his podcasts. They're all done via Zoom anyway, so it's easy to record. And why not come up with some brief promo videos? So on this one, Evan interviewed a former NFL player who's now a financial advisor. And it's 45 seconds, so let's just play it. And Brendan, this is for you. I forgot to click the share sound button, so we all do that. We all do it. All right, here it comes.
How important is it for an athlete in their 20s to really start thinking about money, saving, and thinking about life off the field?
The sad part about it is I think the moment you get drafted and you start thinking about money, or not drafted, you're working from behind. I mean, it's almost late in the game. That's why, with the initiatives we're doing at UBS, you want to start at the collegiate level, or you can go further back at the high school level, making sure that, these individuals, both men and women and athletes, understand the basic fundamentals of finance, okay?
So as you can see, that's quick. It's not the fanciest video in the world, but you get a taste of what the guest was like. You get a taste of the fact that we wish the guest had a better microphone, but such is life. And Evan can put that on social media and then provide a link to click through the podcast. And you're a lot more likely to catch someone and get their attention for 45 seconds to listen to a little snippet and be like, yeah, I want to listen to more of that. So, so before we get started in earnest here, does anyone have any questions or challenges they have right now with their podcast that they'd like to throw out to the group? If not, you can wait, and you'll have opportunities later. Seeing no hands. Brendan's thirsty. That's the only thing I see. Sorry, that's the second time I've picked on you, Brendan. All right, let me introduce our guest speaker, Deirdre McCarthy, who's been a dear friend of mine for years. She has a background in theater. She's a professor. She right now is a communications consultant, but she teaches everything from acting to public speaking to improv comedy. And I should mention that I am a student in her improv comedy class for the main purpose that, well, number one, it's fun, but number two, it actually really comes in handy with podcasting because it kind of teaches you how to keep the interview going, keep something going. Enough about me. Deirdre, the floor is yours.
Hi. So he neglected to say that my company's name is Face to Face Pro. So that's okay. That's my company. And half of what I do is work with corporate people about professional presentation skills, things like that. My other half of my business is performer based. So I teach people to be voiceover artists and on-camera actors and podcasters and so forth. So my entire background has been a mesh of communications. I was a public speaking competitor in college because I was a glutton for punishment, but also a theater major. And I have degrees in theater education as well as directing. So I have found that the world of communications and theater really mesh together. So I bring each set of skills from the other when I'm dealing with the other. So lots of really crossover, important informational things that have to do with podcasting. So let's get right to it. So let's talk about sort of the nuance of podcasting, and that is that you need to make connections. Okay, so podcasting has always been a connection-driven field, right? Right from the beginning. In fact, it's so connection-driven that it has changed advertising forever. For those of you who were here last time, I briefly talked about that. So when we listen to a podcast, we listen on our headphones or in our car when we're driving. It's very much a solitary thing. Typically, we don't sit around with our friends and listen to podcasts. We'll talk about them later, but we don't typically listen to them together. So we feel like we have a relationship with the person who's doing the podcast. And what that means is the most successful podcasters will be the ones that can create a relationship with the people that they're speaking to. That relationship is so strong that advertisers began having podcasters be spokesperson for their products rather than creating an ad. And that has spilled over. So for my clients that do voiceover work with me, they have also seen a huge change since COVID, and it affects podcasts as well. So prior to COVID, advertising was definitely leaning towards very personal, conversational type of approach. But COVID has taken that to an entirely new level because people have spent the last year not connecting. So you want to go to the top, you need to make people feel like you have a personal relationship with them. And it doesn't matter what your subject matter is, even though some lends itself to that more than others, right? So how do we do that? How do we become connected with our audience? There's a number of different ways. So let's talk about the things that we do wrong and how to fix them. So I briefly spoke at the beginning when we were talking about Conan's about not introing your intro. Okay. I don't just mean that in podcast land. We do that in life, right? We do that in life. We give a ton of beginning information before we get to the thing that anybody's interested in hearing about, right? We do it because we're afraid of being too abrasive, too abrupt, of jumping right in, of being shocking, of maybe where we want to test the waters, where we're told our whole lives, tone it down, make it smaller. So we tend to do this big wind up in life, right? So best storytellers, don't intro their intro. So if it's okay with you guys for me to actually call on you as people and ask you to participate in this, I would love that. If that's okay. If you hate that idea completely, you can turn your picture off. I wish you wouldn't though, because we're talking about connecting, right? So let's connect. All right. So if I could first pick on Johanna. Am I saying it correctly? Johanna?
You are. Yes,
Okay.
Johanna.
All right. So Johanna, if you were going to tell me a story about, I don't know, the most embarrassing date you ever went on, right? How would you start?
When it happened, or how
So
I met the person?
So can you do that right now for me?
I'm trying to think of the most embarrassing date I ever gone on.
You can make it up, right?
Okay,
You
I
can
met
make it.
somebody on Hinge. We connected. Finally decided to take it offline. We ended up going to an arcade and gaming. It was all right, but there were definitely times where the person was very embarrassing, got very upset about small things, losing air hockey, and
Okay, so I'm going to stop you right there. And I'm going to say that you just hit the spot where your story starts.
Yeah.
So I'm playing air hockey with this dude, and he throws a temper tantrum in the middle of Chuck E. Cheese. And I thought, who the hell did I just go on a date with? Right? That's where the story starts. Okay. Now that doesn't mean you can't circle back to the stuff before. You may be wondering where I met this prize. Okay. So I'm on Hinge and we connect, and I didn't, think very much about the stuffed animals that were behind him in the picture. That should have been a red flag that he was a Chuck E. Cheese regular, right? And then you're off and running, right? So, I mean, even with, when we do improv skits and we say, okay, we're doing an improv skit about a car accident. So you get in a car accident and you're both okay, but you're not wearing any pants and the police come and you've got to deal with that. Okay. And go. Right. And the people will inevitably start with the longest drive ever. Right. And then is that something in the road? Oh no. And I will tell them that your improv starts with boom. Oh my God, what the hell? Shoot, wish I wore pants. Right. And then you're again, you're off and running. So how does that apply to your podcast? Well, not only does it apply to your intro, right? Hi, I'm Catherine, and today we're going to be talking about everything you hate about tea, right? And then we know exactly what it's going to be about, right? Instead of sort of the big long thing beforehand. So catch our attention, but do that with storytelling. Okay.
May I interrupt for 1 sec?
Yes.
So a lot of our hosts like to introduce the guest, and part of the purpose of introducing the guest is to make the guest feel like a big deal, because that's one of the reasons why we're having them on the podcast. We want to sort of curry favor with them. Sometimes we're literally like networking with them as we're interviewing.
Of course. Of course.
From what I hear you saying, a long intro about the guest might have a spot in the podcast, but not right at the top, or you tell me. Okay.
Yeah. So not right at the top. So like maybe, so we're talking about your intro that's recorded, first of all, that is going to be at the beginning of every single one of your podcasts, right? That should be as short as possible, because the problem is, as Dave said, then you want to introduce what you're talking about this time. And then you want to introduce your guest. We're bored, we're gone, right? We're bored, we're gone. So short intro. This is the podcast about such and such, and here's your host, right? Hey, I'm Deirdre, and today we're going to be talking about the best coaches on earth. And today, Dave's going to make a pitch for being the best coach on earth, and we'll be excited about seeing that. You'll learn more about him later. So let's just jump right in with blah, 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 right? Because we can always circle back, right? So maybe I have Dave say something brilliant, right? And then I say, well, if you're wondering why he's so brilliant, this is his background, right? Because now we're invested in him. We're excited. Right?
Also, through the magic of editing, you can lift the only brilliant thing I said through the whole podcast and put that at the beginning as a teaser quote.
Exactly.
So,
exactly. Yeah. So this also, so number one advice, don't intro your intro for anything. Okay. Like stop doing that. Not only in your actual intro, but in your storytelling. Okay. In your storytelling. So, yeah, jump to the middle. All right. Now, what about when you're interviewing people? Okay. How do you get them to follow along with that? Well, I am a proponent of prep. I know lots of people are like, oh, I want it to be spontaneous and I want it to be amazing. Well, that's great. But you know what's going to happen? Most people are boring. They really are. They're very, very interesting down deep, but their presentation of themselves, they haven't learned how to be a podcaster. They haven't worked with me and become perfect and awesome. And so they are going to intro, and they're also going to talk about things without knowing what an audience would find exciting or not. And you are the professional, and that is your job. So prep, right? That doesn't mean you have to have a script. It means you have to have a framework, and you have to give them advice on where they should be starting, right? How you ask the question is incredibly important. So Evan, do you mind if I pick on you for one quick moment?
Sure.
Okay. So the question you asked your guest on that promo was what?
I have no idea, actually.
Dave, do you remember what it was? Something about what?
Yeah, something like, why is it important for athletes to think about their financial future before their career starts? Something like that.
Sounds right.
It was a little more closed than that. Do you have it up? Is it up?
Oh, poor Evan. It's like now we're going back to the deposition transcript. Yeah.
Oh, it's all good. All
okay.
good.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's just more promotion for you, Evan.
How important is it for an athlete
How
in
important
their
is it?
20s to really start thinking
Okay,
about
so you can
money?
turn it off now.
Okay.
So how important is it for an athlete in their 20s to think about their financial blah, 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 right?
Yep.
Now, if you had had a terrible guest, he might have said, it's very important.
Evan, it's so funny. We were talking about this today. Remember?
We were,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the end of it. That's the end of that exchange, right? So that's really a close-ended question, right? So, okay, how do I get that same information in an open-ended question? You would say something like, tell me all of the things that a young athlete should think about financially when they're in their 20s. What should they think about? Now he's got to talk about them, all of them. Now you're lucky he answered it really well. He answered it as if you had asked it that way. But it's surprising how many people are unskilled at this and will say, well, it's very important.
So
And then that's
can I ask a question about that?
sure.
So let's say I frame it like that. And, he's a former football player, works in finance. Let's say he takes an opportunity to go on for 3-4 minutes to tell us everything that he thinks is important.
What are the top 3 things an athlete should think about in their 20s?
Got it. Okay.
And why? Or what's the number one thing they should think about and why?
Got it.
Right? But it gives them anything that somebody can answer with one word, right, is problematic. So also, this is where prep comes in. That was a great comment, Evan. So if you prepped with him beforehand, right, and you said, I'm going to ask you something about this. So do you have thoughts about what you might want to talk about? Oh yeah, I could talk about this, 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 and this. You know what I would love is if you focused on number 1 and number 2. That doesn't mean you tell him exactly what to say. It means when I ask that question, this is the thing I want you to discuss, and then just talk about it freely, right? Prep. Or we're going to skip all of that stuff and we're going to jump right into the meat of this story, right? Which is right here, right?
Do you have a question? Julie, do you have a question? Just unmute yourself first.
I was gonna sneeze. What about asking the question like, why is it important to?
Yeah, well, that was, I said, if he said, what's the most important thing and why, right? Then that gives somebody room, right?
Oh, okay, I missed that part.
That gives somebody room. So I was laughing because at improv, we talked about this in improv, actually. We do a question game and we talk about not asking yes and no questions, right? So you can shut something down. Do you think that's important? Yes.
Hey, thanks for coming.
Right. It's like, excellent, right? And so you want to go back to, for those of you who are parents, I'm sure at some point somebody taught you when your kids come home from school and you're eating dinner, don't say to them, did you have a good day? Say to them, what was the best thing about today? What was the worst thing? What would you change? Right? Rather than, did you have a good day? Yep. Right? Because then it's over. Okay. So
sometimes TV reporters get made fun of for constantly saying, tell me about that or talk about that. But it really is the right way to go, because if you say talk about that, then, or I personally
talk about your biggest fear and what, just to, help us understand. Help us understand is a great phrase. Help us understand what it feels like to be in your position. Help us understand what it means when this happens. Right?
Yeah, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is if they launch into some story that is just the greatest story you've ever heard. So you're not going to get that from yes, no. Yeah.
Okay. So on that note, oh my God, it's as if I hired you to do segues. On that note, I want to talk about getting the story that you wouldn't have thought of. Okay. So part of what I'm going to talk about right now is my personal value system, belief system that I take into podcasting, I take into teaching, I take into coaching, I take into every single thing I do. I do a workshop for a corporate company, I bring it into that. And that is, how do we connect on a humanity level with people in a way that makes the world a better place, your podcast a better place, your audience in a better place? How do you attach to that bigger thing? And It is so important right now to do that. And it becomes important, especially because we've all been in the house not connecting. But even prior to COVID, the advancement of electronics, okay? I'm not somebody who believes that anything's universally good or bad. I believe it was Plato that thought the invention of books was going to destroy the fabric of humanity, because the measure of a man was their ability to gather information, store it, and orate about it. And if anybody could see anything in a book, the whole world was going to fall apart. So I do believe there are pros and cons to everything. However, our connection to electronics has broken some of our person-to-person connection. Not only are we looking at our phones and our computers, but there's another thing. We are creating how the world sees us via our social media, right? We are creating it. So there is a sense of scripting that comes with that, a sense of staging that comes with that. And I am not against that at all. However, we are desperate and thirsty to know something more. So this started for me one year when I was teaching a class, and we had snow days that year. So many snow days that I wasn't able to teach enough content to give an actual final. So I thought, what am I going to do? It's a core curriculum class. I'm required to give them a final. And so this was the final I gave them. I said, all right, tell me something about yourself. Tell me something I wouldn't know by looking at your social media that has helped define and create who you are. Those two criteria. And I wouldn't, well, and three, I wouldn't know by looking at you. So I wouldn't know by looking at you. I can't see it in your social media, and it has helped create who you are. That is where people's stories live. That is where you learn something incredible, that what Dave's talking about. You learn something incredible about that person. And the world is desperate to know those things about people. And you have the ability to get to it. And it doesn't matter how boring, or how, I shouldn't say boring, like cut and dry you think that your information that you have in your podcast is, right? So who here thinks that their podcast is very informative, cut and dry, not necessarily connected to the human spirit per se? Joyce, you're not allowed to say yes because yours is so connected, right?
I don't
Does
think
anybody?
no one's going to want to say yes. We don't have, I mean, Evans is on the law, but it's still a very textured, spicy podcast. So I wouldn't. I
Right,
don't,
because you're talking, so what is, in general, what are you talking about about the law?
I mean, I'm a divorce attorney, but I try to put like a different take on it. So like marriage, how to stay out of my office, money, stuff like that.
Okay, so we had somebody last month that was a little, that was a little bit more cut and dry. I don't, by the way, I don't mean boring. I just mean it's something that you think is just much more informative and doesn't really serve that. Dave, can you think of one of the ones that you work with that maybe?
yeah, I think you were talking about Chris Vrentas, who does an employment law. He's working on an employment law podcast. So yeah, it would be about discrimination law or pretty
And
black and
does
white stuff.
does he interview people?
Yes, experts in the field.
Okay, so give me an expert he would have interviewed.
An attorney who won a discrimination law case on behalf of someone who was forced to change their clothing, even though they maintained their clothing was a demonstration of their religious belief.
Okay. All right. So it would be really easy to get caught up in. So these are the facts. This is what they wore. This is what they were asked to do. This is the legal standing that existed. And this is what we fought on. And this is how we won. Okay. But I guarantee you, everybody would want to hear about So your client, like, what did this mean to them as a human being? Where, or, what was the moment where you really knew that you were going to fight for this person? Why did you feel like you wanted to fight for this person? What made you go into this kind of law in the first place? How did you relate with them? What experiences in your life made you connect on that? Right? What was the moment you saw the jury's faces change? Right? All of a
Yeah,
sudden, you're
sorry, I love that because sorry, I can't help myself.
okay.
The asking about the moment is brilliant because you can't answer that in a boring way. And may I just say, the question you posed earlier which was tell me something that people don't know about you and something that shaped you, is a great Jedi mind trick because you did that in improv class. And my answer was, I'm proud that I get along with my ex-wife. And all of a sudden I'm talking about my relationship with my ex-wife. It's like, wow, she got me to share something pretty personal, like kind of just like that.
And it's funny because I did it I was a professor for 20 years before I opened my own company, and I still teach one class in the sociology department. But I changed all of my finals to that. And I just made it part of, or I would say, I would make sure that we did that at some point in the class. Usually when people were being mean to each other, I would make them sit in a circle and we would do that, because you realize how you're not alone, right? And everybody thinks that their issues are the only ones that exist. And, I'll just give you a quick example. It's a little bit off topic, but it really isn't, because when you do it on your podcast, this is how your podcast listeners feel. So I can tell you that every single year that I do that with students, there's at least 4 or 5 kids in the class that talk about some type of panic disorder or anxiety disorder. Mostly because we're talking people who had full-fledged panic attacks that they thought were heart attacks, that type of thing, or maybe hospitalized. And it's because, well, not only is it extremely stressful these days to be a kid that age, but that is the age where that typically manifests itself, somewhere in high school or college. So there's usually 4 or 5 kids that do that. Now, they've walked into class every day terrified that they might have one in class and nobody would understand and everybody would think they were freaked, that they're somehow weak. So once the first person says it out loud, then everybody else gets brave and we get 3, 4, 5 more of those. And what that does, every semester that I have taught, that has given me the opportunity at the end of that exercise to say, so for every one of you who thought you were the only person who walked in this room with that as an issue, you now know that there are 5 people in this room. And those are the 5 people that chose to speak up. There's probably more. And I can tell you that this happens every semester. So what that means is every room you ever walk into for the rest of your life, there's at least 5 people that also suffer from panic and anxiety.
And so every guest you have on your podcast has something that they'll probably be willing to tell if you ask the right way. And by the way, the great thing about podcasting is if they mention little something or under their breath or, but that's a story for another day, go there, because
that is a story for right now.
Exactly. And it's a podcast. There's no clock usually, and you can always edit it out if it goes awry, but get them to talk. Deirdre, Cindy has a question.
Yes, Cindy.
Hello, Deirdre.
Hi, Cindy.
This is my question. I'm first of all, disclaimer, I work with Deirdre. I coach with her. And I know her fairly well. And I have always been very impressed with your ability to zero in on the crux of an issue. How do you develop that ability?
Okay, so that's called thin slicing. And actually, is it Malcolm Gladwell? Am I saying his name correctly?
Yes, you are.
He talks about it in one of his books. I think it might be The Tipping Point, but I couldn't say for sure. And it is a developable skill. And the big secret is listening, number 1, listening. So we spend so much time, this is tied right into the whole podcast thing. You spend your whole time that your person is answering your question, thinking about what you're going to ask next. instead of really listening to what they're saying, right? You have a plan that you want to do, and you should throw that plan right out the window, because, you know, a framework is great, but you have to listen to what they're saying. You also have to watch for what I call visual and vocal cues, because we spend, you know, people talk about nonverbal. I'm way more specific than that. I talk about visual and vocal cues. So you can literally technically dissect what somebody is doing. Every time they say this, they tap their finger, they tilt their head, they smile, they do this. Now, I know from past experience that when people do this, this is what they mean. And so you start to see patterns that other people don't see. And you start to just get to that information more because you're paying attention to it. So just a quick example of that, when I teach public speaking, one of the things that I do when I first walk in is I give them 2 examples of starting a speech. So I say, okay, the door is closed, the audience is in, you're going to walk in and you're going to present. And I do one version that's terrible and one version that's great. And I say, which version is the best? And they say the second one. And I say, why? And we have lost our ability to critically think because we have GPS and we have Google. So we are very good at getting answers, but we aren't always good at looking at data and dissecting it to figure out why. Okay. So when I ask that question, people will say, you were way more confident in the second one. And I was like, okay, why? Well, you just seemed more sure of yourself. Yes, but why? Because I'm a teacher and I just did those back to back. So clearly I'm not nervous and I'm not necessarily confident. I'm doing something that makes you think that. And they're like, well, I don't know. It's just something about your aura, the way you were. And I was like, no, it's because when I walked in the second time, I didn't turn my back on the door when I closed it. I kept my body outward. And then I made sure that my chin was up and I made eye contact as I walked along. I took larger steps and I went at a faster pace. I smiled as I was walking in and sort of greeted people. And most important, I stopped, swept the room, made sure everybody was paying attention to me, and then spoke. 90% of people will start speaking before they've actually landed in their final spot.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, can I jump in? The advice to listen and watch for visual cues is so spot on, especially in this era of Zoom, because you know we record a ton of podcasts by Zoom, and the reason why we do the Zoom and then only keep the audio is because you want to see the person. And so if you're looking down at your notes, or if you're like me, who's actually on the Zoom call, and for some reason I'm looking at myself on the Zoom, like I'm the Fonz or something, like that's a mistake. Like watch your guests. They're going to be telling you things. So Dee, can I give you a question that just appeared in the chat?
Sure. I just want to finish this thought before, and then, so you really have to look for all of the reasons that get to that place. You have to do the critical thinking and watch every single thing that somebody does. And eventually you'll get to the point where people are afraid of you at parties because you can, you know, say things. What Cindy's, you know, referring to is me being like, so it seems like you really think blah, 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 blah. And then she's like, get out of my head. Where did that come from? And it's like a party trick, you know, and you'll get so good at it. Somebody can describe somebody to you and you'll go, do they also blah, blah, blah? And do they do this? And do they say this? Oh my God, how do you know that? Because there are patterns everywhere we look. It's not magic. It's observation and it's listening. Right? If you see a guest, like, you know, like, what is it about that makes you a little nervous? Or I see you're laughing behind your eyes. So there's something funnier about that story and I want to know it. Right? If you're not looking, you don't catch that. Okay. Yes, Dave.
So true, by the way, because our instincts a lot of time are if someone is giving a visual signal that they don't want to talk about something, our instincts are to take the easy way out and say, okay, I'll move on to question number 7, you know, like.
Not me, ever.
Well, I know that about you. Here's the question. Is it accurate to say that a podcast that informs, but but also includes a moth hour or This American Life moment is what we're needing to hear. So I know what this means, and maybe you already do too. But in other words, I work with a lot of people who are lawyers, financial advisors, other kind of serious professionals, and some of the information can be dry, and they want to get that out. But do we also really want to go for that zinger moment that you would hear on some of these?
What you want to ask yourself is what is going to make, and again, like my brain incorporates all of the things I teach all over the place that informs everything. And one of the things is I'm thinking about ad copy, right? And what is going to be the word? What is going to be the thing? What is going to be the moment that makes somebody choose your product over somebody else's, right? I do this little thing when people are working as a voiceover person, because everybody thinks, well, I could be a voiceover person. Everybody says my voice sounds great. I've got a voice, I'll just have to say the words, and then they train and they go, oh my God, it's really hard. And the hardest part is step number 3 in my process, which is what are they really selling? And people always want to tell me that they're selling the product, right? Well, they're selling a protein bar. I'm like, okay, well, all the protein bars are selling a protein bar. What are they selling? Because one of them is selling the ability to eat a candy bar and, well, they're selling a meal replacement. No. This one's selling a candy bar experience with the same benefits of a protein bar. And this one's selling not as much protein, but everything in it is all natural. It's nuts, berries, seeds, and honey. So you won't get as much protein, but you won't have to worry about garbage in you. And the other one is selling 40 grams of protein, and it tastes like something you took out of the cat box, but that's okay because you're going to go lift weights, right? So they sell different things, right? So if you're doing a podcast about law or business or whatever, what is going to make yours the one that I listen to? And I'll tell you, it's going to be the idea that you hear me, you see me, you connect to me, even if I'm only on the other end of some earbuds, right? So I know this stuff is really, really dry, but imagine what it's like to have your finances in ruin. It's awful. It's painful. I know that because I did this, and the other thing. So I'm telling you this dry information because I want you to be successful. So let's just make a deal. We're going to get through the icky part, and then we're going to talk about some success stories. Won't that be fun? Right? That connection that you can make with somebody is what makes you different. Is what makes you different. Right? And resist the idea of telling your own story when you're the person on the other side. There are moments where that works. And certainly when you're the podcast guest, absolutely. But it is so prevalent in podcasts that the guest just starts to say something interesting. And then the podcaster's like, oh my God, you're right. That reminds me of when I blah, 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 blah. We're like, ooh.
Yeah, I do that all the time. And by the way,
you actually do.
Yeah,
Dave.
that reminds me of a story, by the way, which I'd like to no. The only, okay, I am guilty of it for sure, but the only, I would push back slightly in that the listener, you want the listener to return to your podcast when that guest is not on also. So what I completely agree that if you are taking away a story from your guest, then you've committed a sin. But once the guest tells a story, if you have a similar story, I think people do. It's supposed to be like listening in on a conversation.
Think about dollops, right? Think about dollops. Think about little moments that you can sprinkle in that illuminate things without it being, the guest should talk more, right? The guest stories should be longer. And yours should be that little add-on, unless you're a solo person, in which case you're trying to get to the center of the story, get to, don't intro. I'd love to take a minute and ask people, based on what you've just heard my area of expertise is, what is the biggest challenge you think I would be able to help you with right now in your podcast? So I haven't talked to Joyce yet, and are you a Sharon person as well, Joyce? I think we
I grew up there, but I live in Cambridge.
I think we might have gone to high school together. What year did you graduate?
83.
Okay, so you graduated with my sisters, Megan and Maureen Silva.
So actually, I didn't go to Sharon High School. So
Oh, well, then you would know them.
I didn't know.
All right,
Sorry.
so that's okay. So tell me, what's your biggest challenge? What's your biggest issue? What do you think you're not doing well?
On the podcast?
Mhm.
Oh, so I feel like I've been kind of making this up as I go along because I got into podcasting and cannabis simultaneously. So
Mhm.
I do treat this like it's a radio show. That's how I kind of based it. That's how I sort of created the format.
Mhm.
I like having Dave as my co-host. We do a little, now I'm like, are we chatting too much? I used to have a co-host season 1 and then I don't. So Dave has become my co-host and my male foil. So whenever I have my guests, because I'm only women, he's
Yes.
always, yeah, he takes it on. So I feel like that's cute. I like that part, but is that too much? I don't know.
No, well, so again, as long as it's information that is relevant to
Yeah.
the people listening, right?
And I'm
As
very,
long as
and I do
it's
a lot of
not
work. It's
just-
like, yeah, it's effortless effort. That's what I call it. Like I do.
Joyce
So
does
the-
a ton of prep. She knows the landscape so well, and I speak about somehow I managed to suppress my usual instincts, and I only talk for like 2% of her podcast because she doesn't need me. She knows the guests very well. But Joyce, I guess the question is, are you always comfortable with? I feel like you talk about 20% of the time, and you do let your guests talk about 80% of the time.
And I learned that because I started podcasting with a media guy who, when he was doing the podcasting, all he did was talk. He literally never listened to the guests. So I basically did the opposite of what he did because I found it so annoying, especially with my women guests who I was trying to, I don't know how to interview people. It was really just me trying to listen to them. And I do have a list of questions because I think I know what the story I want to tell. But Dave can see me. I'm very good at sort of like picking up on something and bringing it to another spot. But I do try to bring it around to the end of the story because I do just treat it like a storytelling adventure.
Okay,
And I
so
start the first question. Yeah.
I know
you
what
just
you're
made a
saying.
great point that you are the story wrangler. Okay,
Yeah.
so everybody remember that you are the story wrangler. So it is your job to pull it back in and bring it back. I want to go back to something you said though about that you got into it simultaneously. So I'm curious as to whether you include your learning curve and your lack of knowledge that's now getting knowledgeable in your spiel.
Oh, about cannabis all the time. Oh yeah.
Yeah, because
Okay.
that's a really great thing for people to note. We think that we have to sound like experts, but we love somebody that's learning along with us. That's a really good take. Awesome. Alan, what do you got for me? What's going on with yours? What do you think you need to work on, shift, change? What's your biggest challenge?
Actually, I don't have a podcast. I'm actually on this for a timely reason to do some research because I'm usually the guest on podcasts. I've listened to myself, and some of them, like you said, I just drone on and on and on, and I find I'm putting myself to sleep. So I'm trying to sit on a different angle to see how podcast works, to try to make sure that what I'm giving as far as content pops and is timely and relevant and engages with the listener.
So you need to start at the car crash, Alan.
Yep.
Trust yourself that you can circle back. So what kinds of things do you talk about?
Well, they asked me about a lot. I've been on for like one of the ones I'm coming up on is for leadership. And David introduced me as the former mayor. I used to be the mayor of the second largest city in Rhode Island. So everyone's asking about politics, leadership. More recently, they've been jumping on for the anti-Asian violence that's going on across the country. So it just depends on the different areas.
Okay, so whatever you would answer, I want you to take the first 3 minutes off.
Yep.
Right? So if I was to ask you to comment, so without changing right now, if I was to ask you to comment on anti-Asian violence, right? What would be your go-to? What would you say?
Basically, let me just think. And this is a tough one where you're talking about, just transfer back into it. Imagine your grandmother's finger getting bitten off. Well, this just happened yesterday in New York City, and it's still happening every single day in different parts of our country. And that's an experience that we have had as Asian Americans, not just now, but since the Exclusion Act back in the 1800s.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you that that's actually an excellent answer.
Great.
So you started at the car wreck, which is the imagine, right? So there's nothing boring about that answer. And that's how you should answer everything, right? No matter how dry the subject is, right? So what was it like to be mayor? Right? Let me tell you about my best day as mayor and my worst day as mayor. All of a sudden, I'm like, I'm in, right?
Gotcha.
So that technique you just did, I think you're hard on yourself. That's, and realize that we don't need to know a ton of details, because if you have sparked so you just brought me to another really important point. You don't have to give us everything that you know. So sometimes the most boring person is the person who's the biggest expert on something. And we want them on our show because we're like, oh my God, they're an expert. They're going to be so interesting. But they can't disseminate what it is, right? Right. So I say you have to give them the outline of the speech, right? So imagine you're writing a speech and you've got your topic sentence, you've got your 3 main points, you've got a little blurb about each 3 things, and then you've got your conclusion, right? So your entire visit on about, being mayor or Asian violence is going to be included in that. Your goal is to get somebody to then look stuff up or ask you questions or go further down the rabbit hole or have an awareness that leads them somewhere else. Your job is to light the flame. Your job is to be the spark. You do not have to be their master's degree. You just need to be the recruiting video. Okay? Right? And it's the things that are really important to you. Maureen, I haven't met you. I don't know you. I haven't heard from you, but you've got perfect hair. So I feel like
thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I don't have a podcast, but I am loving everything you're saying. Yes. But, and I don't even want to use buts. I think you're brilliant. I'm just soaking all of this up. And I think that, my daughter's getting married in 3 weeks and we're thinking about, fun, sort of interesting things. And one of them is walking into my home